have to observe that you are such a good-looking and well-trained audience that you immediately go silent when you see that spinning globe. You ought to give yourselves a round of applause. You're doing great. So welcome to the second half of our doubleheader and the start of an extraordinary season of Northwestern Michigan College's International Affairs Forum. And right now, I cannot think of a more marvelous time to silence your cell phones. So take the advantage of this opportunity. We all welcome all who are joining us in person, as well as those from across the globe who make up our live stream audience. It is your membership that makes these programs possible. We also recognize Mercantile Bank for sponsoring this program. Thank you. Your support is critical. Now, as most of you old-timers know, there's an opportunity for questions later in the program, so we are distributing cards that will be gathered later. We're going to work really hard to get to as many of your questions as we can. If you're a student, please write student at the top of your card. Students must have a voice, and they have the greatest investment in the future of our planet. Now, let me tell you a bit about our featured speaker. Dr. Fiona Hill is a senior fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. In November 2022, she was appointed chancellor of Durham University in the United Kingdom. She is simultaneously a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. From 2017 to 2019, she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the U.S. National Security Council, and earlier as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. In the fall of 2019, she testified before Congress in the impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump. She is the author of There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, and she is the co-author with Clifford Gaddy of Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. Hill was Director of Strategic Planning at the Eurasia Foundation in Washington, D.C. She has served as a director at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She has written extensively on issues related to Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia, regional conflicts, energy, and strategic issues. Dr. Hill holds a master's in Soviet Studies and a doctorate in history from Harvard University, where she was a Frank Knox Fellow. She also holds a master's in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews University in Scotland and has pursued studies at Moscow's Maurice Thorez Institute of Foreign Languages. Her lecture on freedom of fear for the BBC was broadcast in December 2022 to an audience of over 200 million. That same month, she was awarded the insignia of Knight First Class of the Order of the Lion of Finland. Sadly, I've truncated her biography because to give her full credit would mean there'd be no time left in the program for her to speak. Stan Otto is our own co-chair of the International Affairs Forum Advisory Board and will be our moderator this evening. He was a senior diplomat in the Department of State with 40 years expertise in promoting international cooperation and understanding, including policy planning, negotiating, and management in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. He has intimate knowledge of the government, economy, culture, and languages in Germany, France, and Japan. Prior to the Foreign Service, he was a Fulbright lecturer in Taiwan and taught at universities in Iran and Egypt. He also served in the Peace Corps in Morocco and Cameroon. Now, dear audience, please help me welcome Dr. Fiona Hill and Stan Otto.
Very good. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Once again, thank you and welcome, Fiona. Glad to finally see you in Traverse City and here in our forum. So thank you.
No, well, thank you. I'm really delighted to be here. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you for the weather. Whoever got in touch with the weather gods, it's amazing.
Well, we did that on purpose.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
Now, we have a lot of topics to go through. Russia is a big elephant, and we have lots of sides to look at. But before we hit that, I wanted to mention here, I was reading your book, There's Nothing for You Here, and I understand those are the words of your father. And he was urging you to get out into the world or someplace. And I was just wondering how you chose Russia as a topic.
Yeah, my father actually said this to me, there's nothing for you here. The full sentence was, there's nothing for you here, pet. In Northern England, the term of endearment is pet, but the editor took that off because he thought then it would get categorized across, kind of books about cats and dogs and, other, kind of domesticated animals, so that was kind of... but this was when I was in high school, actually about the same age that my daughter is now. She's a senior in high school. And I had been studying languages, and I was getting extremely interested in what was going on in the then Soviet Union. And my dad was actually stating in some respects the obvious, because I was growing up in a very small town in northeast England that had fallen on very hard times. I mean, there are many places around here in Michigan that are very similar. It'd been the center of coal mining and railways, and at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, and then just taken a nosedive, in the subsequent years. My dad had been a coal miner. He'd lost his job in the mines 5 times. His mines closed down, then in a brickworks and a steelworks, and eventually he'd got a job in the local hospital, where he was lucky to get a job with the National Health Service as a porter. And I had various jobs cleaning in the hospital, and I also worked in a bar across from the hospital. And this was actually one night. My dad was the porter who brought people in to the emergency room. They'd be in the bar, drink too much, have an accident or get in a fight, and we'd send them over to the emergency room across the road. I mean, it was very efficient. But my dad would worry about this, and when he'd finished his shift, after taking in my patrons from the bar, he'd come over and walk me home. And at this point, I was hoping to do well in my exams at school, and hoping to go to university. And if I wanted to do something to languages, my dad said, "Well, there's nothing for you here, pet. If you go down that path, you certainly won't get a job, in international affairs. Here in Bishop Auckland, you're going to have to leave." And of course, I was thinking about that and feeling, rather sad about it. I actually like my hometown. I obviously like my parents, and I really was hoping that I'd be able to find something in the region. But at that point, I had got interested indeed in studying Russian, because this is the period, the 1980s, of all the war scares between the Soviet Union and Europe and the United States. It was Europe's version of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1980s, with the stationing, and Stan, you were probably there in the middle of all of this, with the stationing of SS-20 missiles by the Soviet Union in the East, in the Eastern Bloc, and the Pershing missiles in Europe, so new categories of strategic and intermediate nuclear weapons. And we were all convinced that there was going to be nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. A lot of this was propaganda coming from the Soviet Union, of course, stirring things up. It was the advent of the campaign against nuclear weapons, the campaign of nuclear disarmament, CND, lots of protests. And the whole feeling in the era was that we were just about to all disappear into nuclear Armageddon. We've actually come full circle in many respects. And one of my great uncles, who'd gone all the way through World War II, had said to me, "Well, Fiona, you've been studying languages. I'd done French and German at school. I'd been on some exchanges. Why don't you study Russian and figure out why they're trying to blow us up?" And I thought, yeah, why not? Kind of instead of panicking and hiding in the cupboard under the stairs like Harry Potter, which is kind of what they advise you to do in the advent of a nuclear war, I would, or lie in a ditch if you were caught outside. It wasn't a very hopeful prospect. I thought, well, maybe I could study Russian and maybe I could become an interpreter. And I imagined myself sitting with those great big giant earphones on, maybe doing some interpretations, perhaps even at the United Nations, I thought. Some of my classmates thought I was mad. They said, "How would somebody from Bishop Auckland get a job at the United Nations?" And I thought, well, maybe it's not impossible. I'll kind of figure something out. And so I decided I was going to study Russian. And there wasn't much likelihood of getting a job with Russian in Bishop Auckland, so it was kind of obvious I would probably have to go somewhere else.
Well, that's all quite interesting, and kind of making the best of a hard situation and getting out and using the opportunities you have.
That's right.
Yeah. I guess we should turn to the hard questions now.
That's right, yeah.
Because there are, I mean, concerning Russia, we're concerned with most things about Russia. And the big thing, of course, is the Russian-Ukraine war. I mean, you see every day, I saw an article about 500,000 casualties.
Yeah, yeah.
Yesterday, I saw something about 1 million casualties. I don't know what to believe. I mean, everybody has different figures. But what is your assessment of where that war stands now? Is there any way of going forward?
Yeah, we actually had a map that someone had pulled together a bit earlier. I don't know if we could get the map up, but I think it might be just helpful. There we are, just to concentrate the minds here, because you can, everyone, and you're seeing this in the paper all the time. And most of the focus is on movements along these, various lines that, we see here. And I think Alex, who put the map together, had found it on a link from Brookings to the Institute of the Study of War, referenced by one of our Ukraine indexes. We've been, trying to monitor within the Brookings Institution where the war stands. But part of the problem is we're always just judging it by the movements of lines across this front, which, takes us back into history to the World War I. I mean, all of us who have, studied history and looked at the history of World War I, it's been trench warfare, and do the front lines move, one way or another? There'd be great battles in World War I over mounds, which were Hill 60 or Hill 66 in Flanders, which is really just a kind of a lump of, maybe what was once a copse of trees in a farmer's field somewhere in Belgium and in the Low Countries that was obliterated and just turned into a mound of mud. My grandfather, my father's father, fought in World War I and went through the entirety of the war from basically 1914 to 1918 in the Royal Field Artillery. So back in the day, he would have been on these front lines. And the war in Ukraine is this horrific mixture of World War I trench warfare, where we obsess about these movements of these lines, backwards and forwards. 21st century war of drones. World War II type, wars where you have tanks moving around at different points. We're talking about tanks, and now we're talking about missiles and long-range, strikes by Ukraine, deep into Russia. We've seen the Ukrainians recently hit buildings on the outskirts of Moscow. We're seeing, Russia get drones and missiles from Iran and ammunition from North Korea and all kinds of supplies from China on a dual-use goods, bringing a whole new dimension to this war that we haven't thought about. And this is a mass casualty war as well. And, we're seeing this in the context, again, I keep mentioning, World War I and World War II. This is the largest military series of operations since World War II. And these figures that you've mentioned, 500,000, 1 million, these are the various estimates of the number of casualties. The 500,000 is recently, or 600,000 even, on the Russian side, not just in terms of people killed, but in terms of people severely injured, sufficiently that they've been taken off the battlefield. And in the Russian case, we know that people are not being properly treated. They're being sent right back to the battlefield again. And the Russians are not just sending to the battlefield their own citizens. They've been press ganging in the kind of way that militaries did in the medieval or kind of 19th or 18th and 17th century, in terms of literally ripping people up off the streets, taking people out of jails and pushing them to the front. This is a war of attrition, the kind of wars that Mike would have studied when you were in the military academies, the kind of wars that we thought we would never be fighting again. Basically, the 1 million casualties is what people are estimating now in terms of the number of people being killed and injured on both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. And could we have imagined something of this scale 2 years ago? So putting aside where the current trenches are, the front lines of this territory, we are back to the kinds of large-scale conflict that we could not have envisioned, we said would never happen again after World War II. We said it would never happen again after World War I. We said it would never happen again after World War II. And here we are. This started as one man's special military operation, and it's turned into the biggest conflagration in Europe again since the 1940s and 70 plus years. So where are we with this? We are with a war that is basically threatening the entire security and of Europe and the borders of all of these surrounding states, because Ukraine was independent for 30 years, recognized as fully independent for 30 years, including by Russia, by China, by North Korea and Iran, countries that are all now participating in this war one way or another. And it supposes an enormous threat to all of the neighbors, because so many of the neighboring states were once either part of the Russian Empire or were once part of the Soviet Union. And the country to the north of Ukraine, Belarus, we never talk about it anymore. It's essentially been absorbed into Russia. There's a union state arrangement between Russia and Belarus was used as a platform for launching the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces, 2+ years ago. And so wherever this conflict ends up, and we can talk more about where it might end up, it has to be resolved in such a way that the sovereignty of the other countries of the former Soviet Union, Belarus, again, is already almost lost to history as a sovereign state, and that shouldn't be the case. But the Baltic states, we see Lithuania on here and a little bit of Latvia and Estonia, but also Moldova. You can see Chisinau, the capital of Moldova here. We can see the Caucasus states of Georgia and Armenia, Azerbaijan. We can't see Central Asia here on the other side of the Caspian, but there have been Russian territorial claims made to Kazakhstan, because the northern part of Kazakhstan was also settled by Slavs and was part of the extension of the Russian Empire and part of the Soviet Union. There's a great fear here, and justifiably so, that Putin might have more designs, and that if we end up with a slicing and dicing of Ukraine, the recognition of this territory that has been taken by Russia, give or take where the lines are particularly moving, as annexed by Russia, that this is going to give Putin the opportunity to put pressure on other countries in the region, but also questions the whole post-World War I and post-World War II settlements of Europe. So that it doesn't really end there, that we don't really have the kind of formula for success here and for deterring other kinds of conflicts. And you've been in many of these places yourself that are more likely to be massively affected by this.
But seeing the level of death, like at least 120,000 Russians.
Yeah, at least.
When you think back to the conflict in Afghanistan, it was roughly 15,000.
That's right, over a 10-year period, 15,000 over a 10-year period.
Yeah,
We're talking about at least 120, maybe 160,000 over 2.5 years.
Yeah, but 15,000 was enough to make them withdraw.
That was the Soviet Union as well, which is a much larger state. I had my master's degree in Soviet studies, and I just got the degree newly minted in June, and by December the Soviet Union had gone. That's why I did history as a PhD after that. It was kind of one of those, oops, that wasn't the right thing to be studying. But it really brought home, what a big difference we have between the Soviet period and now with Russia. Putin is basically launching this on a population that's a fraction of the size, almost half the size of the Soviet population, which was 270 million. There's about 140 million, in Russia now. And as we've just said, the casualty rate is staggering. So Putin is assuming that, in a war of attrition, if we think back to World War I and also World War II, Russia actually collapsed in World War I as a result of a war of attrition, just to be, frank, which is Putin never talks about World War I, because although in World War I, Russia was technically on the side of the French and the British and opposed to Germany, the strain of the war was too much for the Russian Empire. And they had huge losses. We're not entirely even clear about the size of the losses for Russia in World War I. There also was trench warfare. They were, obviously fighting, over to the east of Germany. But the military collapsed, and the Tsar was in charge of the military collapse, and that led to a discrediting of the Tsarist regime and eventually revolution. Now, Germany also collapsed as a result of the war of attrition in World War I, and the German monarchy, the Reich, fell apart as well, and we ended up with the end of the Kaiser, and also Austria-Hungary, part of that same alliance, fell apart. That was the death knell of these great monarchical empires from World War I, because they all got overstretched by war. Putin ignores that history, and he takes instead the history of World War II, where basically the Soviet Union prevailed in a war of attrition over Germany because Germany was overextended and Germany was the invader. Well, this time around, Russia's the invader. But Putin is reading into his interpretation of history. He's kind of a self-taught historian, and believing that Russia will prevail just simply by throwing enough men, literally men, at the problem. Because the lesson he took away from World War II, ignoring the lessons of World War I, which were actually not dissimilar, was that you had Stalingrad. You basically just an enormous battle where the Germans were literally bled out by the Soviets' willingness to just put more and more men onto the front. He also looks at the lessons from the siege of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, which you would actually think again would be a cautionary tale for him, because his parents were, and his mother and brother, in fact his brother died during the siege of Leningrad, what would have been an older brother, were trapped during the siege. His father was in a battalion of special forces sent to try to pick off the Germans behind the enemy lines. His mother nearly died, but this siege went on pretty much as long as this war has already gone in Ukraine, and the city was only saved by the collapse of the German forces. It wasn't that there was a great heroism, apart from an amazing state of survival in Leningrad, but they were saved by the collapse of the German forces. Now, he could take lessons away from this, which would actually be a cautionary tale for what's happening to Russia now. Russia does not have infinite manpower. I mentioned before, they've already taken everybody out of the jails. He's recently, they're taking people from around in Central Asia and press-ganging people into the front. He's just announced that there's going to be another 180,000 forces sent to the battlefield, which is going to bring it to over 1 million in terms of the forces. But he's just announced that. We don't know that he's got that manpower. The Russian government has been paying people contracts to basically go and fight to the front. They've increased the payments threefold, but they're not getting the same rate of uptick as they had before, uptake, which is hardly surprising given that this is a death sentence. And there's been an awful lot of reliance on non-ethnic Russians to go and fight. Tatars, Bashkirs, Chechens, Central Asians that are getting pulled into the war who might have dual citizenship or sometimes not Russian citizenship, or Indians, people that they can picking up from all over the place, often under false pretenses, and there's starting to be a backlash. So it's not clear that they can keep this up indefinitely. And so I think part of the push that you're starting to hear about negotiations, a lot of the propaganda that's coming out of Russia, suggesting Ukraine's defeated, that Ukraine's losses are so high they can't keep up, is because Putin would actually like to freeze the conflict in place. At the beginning of the conflict, they were short of weaponry, hence he had to turn to Iran for drones. They're starting to produce enough of their own drones, but they're still short of ammunition. And although they've got their war machine in place, they need men, to basically be making the armaments. They're not bringing women into the factories in Russia like, we did during World War II, or they did during the war. And, they've had to take a lot of ammunition from North Korea. They're incredibly short of all kinds of other machinery, machine tools, propellants for many of the missiles, because they don't produce that at home. China's providing a lot of this. There will come a point where they will not be able to continue at the rate that they're going, and we're reaching that tipping point now. So the expectation is that Putin is pushing to get this kind of frozen in place so we can kind of recoup the armaments in the defense sector, but also, kind of find ways of compensating for what could potentially be, kind of a lack of manpower. So a lot of this messaging that's getting out there, of course, this brutality, the level of death and destruction is sickening. And he's kind of hoping that, basically, either the humanitarian impulse or also just the political will in America or in Europe will fade to basically support Ukraine. So there's a kind of an incredible, just relentless beat of propaganda right now. And you've seen that the US government is taking some action against Russia Today, RT. We're trying to kind of cut off, a lot of the propaganda, which is whipping up sentiment about the Middle East as well, and, about United States politics, all kinds of interference. But RT is incredibly active around the globe, especially in other English language environments like India. So RT is actually using English language print media in India. The Hindustan Times, the India Times, I mean, probably places and these publications you're very familiar with from your long career in the State Department, and all of that's now kind of, continues to filter in. So we've got an incredible problem on our hands here about how to kind of create a coherent process to address this. I mean, ultimately, we want to get this war stopped, but we don't want to have it on Vladimir Putin's terms. And our political process, our debates, the politicization, the polarization, fragmentation that we have here is a huge problem. We have to, basically try to be focused on trying to get Ukraine through this hump of our political season, and then also the winter into next year. Because what Putin is also doing, in addition to all of the propaganda and the influence operations to get us to push Ukraine towards the negotiating table right now, is to do what he saw the Germans trying to do in Leningrad, which is besiege Ukraine and destroy all of its infrastructure. So, we've really seen now taking out deliberately of all of Ukraine's electricity and power generation. Basically devastating all of the power plants, the electrical grid. They've also taken control of the big nuclear power plants like Zaporizhia. You can see, kind of on the map here, actually, I think there's one where it's a bit closer in. I don't know whether the second map, see if I can get that. There we are. There, we can see Zaporizhia appear on the map, well, kind of at the tip of the blue here. There is the largest nuclear plant in Europe there, which I'm sure many of you are reading about all the time in the press. And that produced about 50% of Ukraine's electricity. After France, Ukraine was the largest producer of civilian nuclear power in Europe and has some of the largest nuclear power plants, and they've been basically taken offline. There's another one at a place called Ukrainsk, which is very close, also to the line of action here. So they're kind of depriving Ukraine of any kind of opportunity to basically maintain its power production. And even in the best case scenario, Ukraine's going to be short of about, a good, 25% of the power that it needs to get through the winter, even if Europeans and others can help them, bridge the gap. So there are so many factors here that are operating against Ukraine that Putin's hoping that defeatism will set in before he himself runs into the peak of his problems, which would probably be in the next year and the kind of year after, because he cannot keep this up forever and he knows it. And also that will then threaten his own survival and his own regime, because he himself has become so wrapped up in this war that although it's now Russia's war because he's made everybody in Russia complicit, it's really ultimately Putin's war. He made this decision to go to war. Nobody pushed him into it. He did this all of his own. And so if he doesn't succeed on his own terms and getting, at least some recognition of all of these, marked off territories, there will be ultimate questions about what was all of this death and destruction for. This won't be World War II. This will be more like World War I.
Yeah, you're implying that Putin is pushing his own country towards collapse.
He could well be.
I mean, because you have the population, 146 million.
140 million or so, and declining.
I mean, they're losing a million a year just about. I mean, the economy, it's gone from mostly petrol, things like that. Now it's a war economy, but not very healthy. I mean, militarily, we saw how successful they were in Ukraine. Nobody's so worried except the atomic weapons. And that's a big question because they keep rattling that cage and saying, well, we still have them, we can do something. But going back to my original question, what kind of end games do you think are really realistic? If we're talking about, one side winning, if there's a ceasefire, what is the most realistic?
Look, I think, if we're looking at it in terms of, as I said at the very beginning, movements of territory, we're not going to, really get there in terms of this line moving that way, this line moving another way. And if we think in terms of winning, I think that's also, kind of very difficult, winning and losing. Everyone's lost at this particular point. I mean, Putin, if he wins, this is a very Pyrrhic victory, if he wins control over this, for all the reasons you're laying out. The Russian economy on the surface right now looks pretty good, so I think Putin thinks, because he has this war economy, it seems to be operating, but it's setting long-term problems in motion, particularly given demography, all innovation being tied to warfare, lack of prospects for people. He's selling a past and he's bringing destruction. He's not selling a future. And Russia's becoming more and more dependent on China and on other countries over, the longer term. And the most innovative members of their society are also leaving. You've had a mass outflux of, when you talked about 1 million people lost, 1 million people leaving, which is, I think, what you were implying, because you've got so many, particularly young Russian men who've gone to other places around in the region or further afield because they don't want to get, caught up in conscription. So a way for this to end would have to be, through a recognition on Russians' part that this is a massively losing proposition. It just seems very hard to imagine, given the links between Putin himself and his self-preservation and the survival of his regime, that he's going to come to that revelation. He wants us to come, on contrary to the realization that Ukraine can't win and therefore we can't win, and this is very damaging to us. Now, what does Ukraine winning look like? I think is kind of part of your question as well, right? I mean, ultimately, Ukraine's goal is to make sure that Ukraine doesn't control its territory. And again, I want to emphasize, Putin has no right to that territory whatsoever. Every European country around Ukraine has had its borders changed. I mean, if we look back at the history of the United States, the borders have changed the whole time. Putin's basically saying that Ukraine belongs to Russia because of a whole series of historical developments. If any of you watched the Tucker Carlson interview, Tucker Carlson just couldn't keep up with the kind of history lesson and kept saying, is this really relevant, Mr. President? But this was really, Putin's attempt to kind of create all kinds of historical justifications for why Ukraine belongs to Russia. And look, we're sitting in an area here in Michigan that was contested. I mean, just north of the border was what used to be called British North America instead of Canada. You've had the French here, you've had wars all over, this peninsula and the whole area here in the Great Lakes. All of these borders have changed. Putin says that Ukraine agreed to be part of Russia in 1648 and 1649 in exchanges of letters with the head of the Cossacks and the Tsars because of invasions on the one part from Turkic peoples and on the other from Poles and Lithuanians. What was the United States in 1648 and 1649? That kind of Scotland was independent from England at that point and having huge battles. There's very few countries that are in the same borders that they were in the 1640s. Poland was actually one of the dominant countries of Europe at the point, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So, I mean, we can't go back to that period, basically. And it is, sad to say, though, that from Ukraine, it doesn't look likely in the short to near term that it will be able to recover all of this territory. So we have to find a formula that makes the prospect of Ukraine at some point being whole. We've found that at different points of the Baltic states, never being recognized as being forcibly reincorporated back into the Soviet Union because they were part once of the Russian Empire. They got their freedom like Ukraine did, and Russia tried to bring them back. Finland. Basically also part of the Russian Empire. The Finns got their freedom 20 years afterwards. The Soviet Union tried to take Finland back again. Finland lost a lot of territory, but it got its freedom. And it also wasn't neutralized. Finland, for the whole kind of period after the 1940s and after the end of World War II, steadily built up one of the largest militaries and civilian defense forces in Europe. And although it didn't join NATO until just recently, it was aligned with other European countries and had all kinds of agreements with them and eventually became part of the European Union. So I think we have to find a pathway for Ukraine that recognizes that Russia has no right whatsoever to sovereignty over Ukrainian territory, Crimea or any part that Russia is trying to justify, and allows Ukraine to basically associate with the rest of Europe and be part of a broader European security network, whether that's NATO or it's a series of alliances which Ukraine is building up. And I would argue you also have to make sure that any territory that falls into Russian hands is demilitarized, not Ukrainian territory. So there's a long way to go between what Putin is basically saying, which is, we can end the war with me getting recognition of the Ukrainian territory I've taken, give or take some moving around of these lines on the map here, and you have a demilitarized, neutralized Ukraine that has no ability to defend itself. And that's just not a recipe for any kind of move forward. So what we really also need is to find a formula that has international pressure put on Ukraine, on Russia rather than on Ukraine, to have a negotiation. That's what the Ukrainians are trying to do at the moment. So you've seen a lot about Ukraine having peace conferences, most recently in Switzerland. And Zelensky talks, frequently about they have a plan, and the incursion recently into the Kursk region, which of Russia, which we can kind of see in that blue stripy line up at the top to the north of Sumy here, is meant to kind of get them, some leverage with Russia. And Ukraine is really trying to get as much support from the international community, not just moral support, but diplomatic support, meaningful support, so that there is actually a proper negotiation, not just a capitulation or an agreement on terms of surrender with Russia. So the Ukrainians have a plan. And I think, we should be trying to work with them on making as much of that a reality. And they're also trying to focus on the humanitarian aspects of the conflict, security for the nuclear and energy generation, food security, because, of course, the Russians also put a blockade on Ukraine's grain exports in the Black Sea. There are all kinds of different ways in which we can work with Ukraine to make the prospect of a real negotiation with Russia in the near term a reality. But it's going to be very easy. That's why I'm putting so many factors out there. We've got to be working on this all the time. It's not going to be so simple as Putin sitting down with whoever he thinks the American president is going to be. Like, we are at a table and saying, okay, you have that, I take this, and actually take everything else on the table while you're not looking, and pull it over here. He has this fantasy that we're going to go back to Yalta, at the end of World War II, and he's going to be sitting there with, the equivalents of Churchill and Roosevelt, FDR, and they're just going to be dividing things up against them. We have to make sure that that's not what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, this is really Putin's war.
It is his war.
And he started it. He's into it. I guess the big question is he was just reelected in March. But he only got, 87%?
Yeah, or 88, I think, yeah.
Well, what happened to the other 12%?
12%, yes, exactly.
Were they all taken to prison or what?
Yeah, actually, probably. Yeah. This is actually embarrassing. That's his highest vote, by the way, his highest electoral tally in the 25 years in which he's been in power.
What a success.
One way or the other. Well, he was a prime minister briefly, of course, for 4 years, yeah.
But what do you think he wants as his legacy? I guess we have him for life at this point. He's been in there 25 years.
Yeah, 25 years.
Since 1999.
Yeah.
Another 25?
Well, technically, you could have another 12. You might notice that was, some time ago he was making fun of Biden's age, and then he stopped. And it wasn't because he, suddenly felt, kind of warm affinity for Biden at that particular point, but he realized, or it was pointed out to him, that he himself would be in his 80s if he gets out to 2036, which is when, his term could expire if he keeps on being re-elected with more and more votes that he had. And, there'd already been questions when he was, returned as the president in 2011, 2012. There were lots of pictures of him and his image being morphed with that of Brezhnev, the old gerontocracy of the Soviet Union, kind of implying, oh my God, this guy's going to be here until, he leaves this mortal coil. And, so he's kind of very well aware that there will come a time where, he's no longer looks like the kind of the macho action man that people were used to seeing in the early phase. In fact, he's already trying to move into the elder statesman phase. And at this point, his legacy is more like being the modern Tsar of Russia. the kind of hyper-powered or empowered constitutional monarch. He's not even going through the pretense anymore of this being a real election. The only really competitor to him was Alexei Navalny, obviously died in a penal colony in the Gulag. I mean, we've really gone back to, you know, the bitterest periods of either the Tsarist era, where, you know, there was the assassinations and the palace coups, or the nastiest parts of the Soviet period with everybody who was a dissident or an opposition figure potentially being incarcerated in the same, you know, harsh, horrific Gulag system. So Putin now sees as his legacy really is him. His legacy is his interpretation of the past. It's Tsar Vladimir. It's the regathering of the Russian lands. It's bringing Ukraine, the country that got away, into the fold. It's justifying his sitting, you know, astride this new reconstituted Russian Slavic union. It's, you know, kind of him leading a vanguard, no longer of the proletariat of the world, but of the reactionary forces. It's back to the kind of 1840s when Russian czars played that same role of trying to kind of get the reactionary, you know, monarchical forces of Europe to push off the forces of revolution and you know, people, you know, having a larger voice. Putin is, you know, really trying to make the world safer for autocrats, and his legacy will be of you know, doing that as he sees it.
Okay, Stan, we're going to try to weave in
Talking
some questions from the
autocrats.
audience at this point.
Are we done?
Or, yeah, well,
Can I do one more question?
Sure, Stan.
One more first.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
We've already been kind of implying that there's international consequences to this, and it's really ironic that one of the excuses that Putin gave for this whole thing was NATO is encroaching, NATO is encircling Russia, and yet there's more NATO next to Russia now than ever in history, and Europe has really responded, both the European Union and NATO itself. How do you see that now? It must, like I say, must be really ironic.
It is ironic, and actually you also, I mean, might remember from, again, the Tucker Carlson interview, which was utterly fascinating. I mean, for those people who haven't watched it, I actually recommend it, because it's absolutely fascinating the way that Putin is, he gets frustrated because Tucker Carlson doesn't want to, you know, listen to an enormous romp through Russian history, you know, according to Vladimir Putin. And Putin handed him over even kind of a package of, you know, like your folder here of, you know, greatest hits from Russian history according to Vladimir Putin, facsimiles of documents from the Kremlin archives. And I don't think Tucker Carlson knew what to do with it. Just kind of took it home and stuck it in his basement, I think. So basically, you know, Putin didn't even talk about NATO and NATO enlargement. And Tucker Carlson kept even saying to him, well, Mr. President, isn't it about NATO? And he kept, no, let's go back to history. It was a different, you know, justification. But of course, NATO was one factor for Putin. He was offended that, as he would put it, NATO encroached, but really that countries like Ukraine and other countries that had been formerly part of the Soviet bloc would want to join NATO. I mean, for him, it's an affront, because this is, you know, kind of, you know, basically an insult to Russia. It's not that he so much saw NATO as a threat, but he saw it as just basically a sign that Russia was being diminished in this sense of being the great superpower with its own bloc, or their empire that once, you know, kind of basically was expanding itself over Eastern Europe. I remember many of the countries that were part of the Warsaw Treaty organization, the WTO, were, because it was named in, you know, Warsaw, part of the Russian Empire. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw, for example, Poland being part of that empire. And of course, the countries that wanted to join NATO first were Poland, Hungary, which seems a bit more ambivalent about it now, and the Czech Republic, because they were the three countries that were also invaded by their own organization, or put under pressure by their own organization. The Warsaw Pact didn't invade NATO countries, it invaded itself. I mean, basically the Red Army went into Czechoslovakia and into Hungary and put a lot of pressure on Poland. And they were the countries that wanted to, you know, basically join in the first instance. And you know, as you say, Putin always was kind of basically threatening that if there was more NATO enlargement, then there would be consequences. And Finland and Sweden never wanted to actually join NATO, and they did precisely because they thought the writing was on the wall, particularly for Finland, that had been invaded by the Soviet Union, previously part of the Russian Empire, that if they're going to mess around in Ukraine, what's to stop them doing another Winter War and another Stalin and moving into Finland, especially as Finland at that point, was one of the few European countries with a very long border with Russia, which they had also always manning and always looking for any sight of the Russians coming over. And once the Swedes saw that the Finns were wanting to go into NATO, the Swedes were like, whoa, the Finns know something we don't. And after hundreds of years of basically being non-aligned and wanting to be neutral, the Swedes took that step too. And yes, that was a big shock, because now we've got all of these countries with very long borders with Russia that have now become NATO members. So Putin himself did the one thing that he said he was trying to prevent. So there is an irony in that. And it's also a sign that other countries have seen the threat from Russia. It's not just this manufactured threat that's coming from the United States or the West. Other countries have read very clearly what Putin intends to do, and they want to make sure that they can stop him. So the Finns joined NATO not to kind of go back to the old Cold War, but because they think that that's the only way of creating a new European security architecture, even if it's not ultimately NATO down the line, that might deter Russia from doing something again. And the Finns realized after what Russia did in Ukraine that they could not rely just on their own means of defense, which were pretty formidable, but that Russia was not playing by any of the rules, because the Russians said they weren't going to invade Ukraine, they did. So what's to stop them from saying they're not going to invade Finland and invade?
Okay. Well, we're going to begin weaving in some questions from the audience. And the first one is from Karen Puschel-Siegel. That is, Russia has been led for millennia by autocrats and despots, and yet somehow we seem to think that there's going to be a new democracy showing up in Russia. Is this naive, and what do we get in the West wrong about Russia? Maybe that's the bottom line. What are we getting wrong in our view of Russia?
Well, look, I think in terms of what do we get wrong, I think partly we don't take into consideration the larger sweep of Russian history. And partly that's because here in the United States we don't kind of think about the larger sweep of history. Our attention spans tend to be short in many respects, also because of the way our political system's set up. Members of Congress have to get elected every 2 years, it's every 4 years for a president. I just mentioned before, Putin's been in power now for 25 years. So we have a kind of, our political system is set up because, we're a democracy, and, the intent is that we refresh ourselves, every, so many years to kind of, bring in new voices. I mean, that's at least in theory, right? That's kind of like what we're always trying to do. But it also means that then we kind of try to think that everything gets a fresh start, that we can always start again. I mean, that's the essence of America, right? Everybody here, for the most part, has come here for a fresh start. I mean, we can kind of look about the histories of our families. I mean, of course, some people have been, brought here under duress, not by intent. We've talked about all of the ways that, the United States also expanded out its territory. Native Americans didn't have a lot of say in, kind of what happened around in the region. But for the most part, people who've come to America have been looking for a fresh start. They don't necessarily want to be bogged down in the history of the places that they've come from. And that often then leads us to kind of misread what's happening in other places where people live in history. And Vladimir Putin lives in a history of his own imagination. I mean, this is, kind of his history. It's his story, his kind of version of history. It's a story, it's a narrative. And I think that we fail to often see those narratives and how they kind of play out in certain contexts, which is why we then don't take seriously often these kind of historicized discussions and motivations and drivers of other people. Putin was very much driven, in this case, by his version of history. And he's read the same version of history, that Russia is always led by leaders from the top. He believes that if you get more pluralism in the system, it leads to chaos. He talks about this all the time. He looks back at, what we would have thought were actually very positive periods in Russian history of pluralism, in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, or the late 80s under Gorbachev, and he sees this as actually recipes for disaster, because what happened? The state collapsed, in his view. When he talked about the great catastrophe of the 20th century, of the collapse of the Soviet Union, he wasn't meaning the communist system, he was meaning the collapse of the state. And his reading of history is a history of pluralism, of democratization, is one that leads to weakness, internal disarray, and collapse. And he thinks that's what's happening here in the United States right now. He sees this as a great moment to create our collapse, because he doesn't see that, our current travails and political debates might lead to, another, kind of period of American flourishing. We kind of reassess and, we come through all of this and, we reinvent ourselves, which is actually tends to be the pattern of American history. He's looking at it in our lens. He gets us wrong as well, although I hope he's got us wrong, this time, because, he looks and says, well, this is, like the history of, what I've seen in Russia. This is chaos. This democracy is just, who shouts the loudest, who pays the most money, and, kind of this is just, all this is teetering around on a precipice. The United States is just going to do what happened in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. It's going to fall apart. It's going to be civil war. Of course, he's pumping all of that up through, Russian propaganda. And so, I think, we mirror image in our own part. We always kind of think that there's an opportunity for kinds of fresh starts over and again. We don't kind of take in the great kind of sweep of history. And, he does the same thing. But I do want to say, though, that I don't think it's naive to think that something else might come out of this. Because also in Russian history, and there's a few people I know around here, who are historians of Russia. I can see a friend, over here who teaches Russian and, Russian history and the history of this region. You also see that periods of war often lead to the realization that Russia needs to reform. The problem is that just like in many things, it goes through a cycle, because reforms often don't lead to the kind of results that you kind of hope in an instantaneous fashion. And, that's what we often see in Russia. You get a period of war, conflict, a period of reform. Things seem to, kind of go in a more positive direction, and people get fed up because, the results are not happening, kind of quickly. But if, have a different international context as well, there might also be kind of pressure, for change in a more positive direction. So don't rule out that there could be a more pluralistic Russia. It won't necessarily be, the kind of a wonderful, democracy. It might be more messy, like some of the other, countries around the world, like India or others, which are democracies and pluralistic, but, kind of messy with all kinds of other, tendencies there as well. But I wouldn't write that off. But, I wouldn't obviously also be expecting something like that to happen, kind of in the immediate future.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hill. The next question, actually, there's been three questions all that are pretty much the same, but I'm going to read the one from our student because that's what we do. But all of them, the subtext is Russian civilian communities' resistance to Putin's policies. And from the student, it says, what do you believe is the reason that the Russian civilian population have not yet been demoralized and are still continuing to support the war in some fashion?
Yeah, I don't think that many people are actively supporting the war, and I think that's what's the confusing thing about this. There's a lot of passive support for the war, and I think there's also a lot of feeling among people that they really can't do anything about it. I mean, you see that in many other settings as well, that they don't feel like they have any agency or any power. And, they will look at what happened to people like Alexei Navalny, an unbelievably brave person, with quite a lot of support, including, interesting enough, among some of the Russian elites. Navalny, survived for so long as he did. There was a critique of basically the regime, because there were people within the regime actually supporting him as well, because they were kind of hoping that he would force change. And when you see someone like Navalny, unbelievably brave, literally sticking his neck out, and then ending up, dying, as he did in a penal colony, but then you see the thousands of people who also came out the streets, one way or another to basically mark his death. So you know that there was a lot of support out there, because for every person who dared to come out, there'd be a hell of a lot of people sitting around at home not daring to do that. You know that there was, something there. And Putin was obviously worried enough about Navalny and about him being the focal point of opposition that he, tried to kill him and have him killed the first time, and eventually, succeeding in having him, essentially be killed by the Russian gulag, the penal system. Navalny was poisoned with Novichok the first time when he was out in the Urals region of Russia, and then out in southern Siberia, basically whipping up the opposition. There were protests across Russia at that point, and there were efforts to get municipal and regional elections to link together across the opposition movement to get people to get their candidates in place. So Navalny was getting some traction. And when he had actually run for office in Moscow, he actually ran as mayor of Moscow at one point, he actually got despite the fact that they made a big effort to keep his supporters off the electoral rolls, he got sufficient of a vote that it would have, raised alarm bells, because Putin wants his 88%, or in one place in Dagestan, he got 110% of the vote. They kind of overfulfilled the plan and had to quickly, alter that one, in a previous election. There is a sense that people could be activated in some way to respond. And I think one of the most chilling moments for Putin and the regime was the Yevgeny Prigozhin insurgency, the mutiny, of a year ago. Because what that showed was there wasn't really active support for Putin at all. So if you remember looking back on this and just, go back and refresh your memory, Prigozhin gets a hell of a long way towards Moscow without getting stopped. And in fact, he only gets stopped because someone intercedes and persuades him to stand down. And he shot down a plane. He's killed, kind of a few forces. And all the way along, he's almost like he's an influencer. People are basically taking selfies with him, and he's stopping along the way, and people are kind of cheering him on. He's become a kind of a cross between, Kylie Jenner and Robin Hood. It's just kind of like kind of a bit of weird. I don't know why that came to my mind, but anyway, I'll have to think of something else. That doesn't quite work, does it? It's kind of a bit of weird. But I was kind of just sort of thinking about, I was once actually with my daughter, and Kylie Jenner was in a store, and there was just like masses and masses of people lining up to take a picture with her. And people were lining up to take pictures with Prigozhin as he was going, by. And there's that kind of, rogue quality that, this is a brutal guy, but he was telling the truth to people about what was going on in the war. And he was marching on Moscow to hold the generals, to kind of account. And nobody does anything. And then, afterwards, of course, we're all kind of wondering, what's going to happen to him? And I have to say that if he hadn't been ejected from the sky, the biggest window in the sky, because remember, people are always falling out of windows in Russia, or, reaching other gruesome and untimely deaths when his plane gets blown up, it would have told you a lot about the weakness of the system, and that Putin was very worried. But Putin waited for several months to lull Prigozhin and his people into a false sense of security, and then, takes them all out at once, again showing that there are problems behind the scenes. So Putin is well aware that this war is not popular. He's tried to make everyone complicit in it. He's using really serious repression so that the threshold of doing anything, is very, very high for people, and no one, or not many people, are as brave as Alexei Navalny. And, he's basically making it very difficult for people in Russia to do anything about it. But there may come a day when, just like there was in World War I, where the soldiers walked away from the battlefield, or the peasants were revolting, or the workers were going on strike, there may come a point where people have just said, well, I've kind of had enough. But it's not really kind of clear where that's going to come from, because what Putin is trying to do is take away anybody who could lead any kind of opposition movement. And that's why the polling is so ambiguous. Russians would like this war to end, but they don't want to lose anything as a result. They don't want to lose their lives, they don't want to lose their livelihoods, they don't want to pay for anything, they certainly don't want to pay for Ukraine to be rebuilt, and they don't necessarily want to give back any of that territory, but they would like this war to go away.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask this question, and it's from one of our online viewers. Can you discuss the consequences of the U.S. election on the conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, look, it's pretty essential here that, how we come out of this, that, we do not lose focus on this. I'm obviously, given my previous position in the Trump administration, really worried about Trump personally. When Trump says, he's going to resolve this in an afternoon, a week, where he's just going to sit down. He is of the mindset, which is, completely false, that, he can just sit down and resolve this one-on-one with Putin. This is Putin's wildest fantasy, by the way. Again, getting back to what I was just saying before about his idea of a new Yalta, with just him and the American president, whoever that is, sitting down and carving up Europe again. What Putin would like is to get the US out of Europe, and he'd like to get back to having, kind of a sphere of influence. And I would like to think that we've moved on in the world beyond spheres of influence. Now, President Trump doesn't want a sphere of influence. I mean, he wanted to build Trump towers all over the place, but he didn't necessarily want to own the countries. He just wanted a piece of the real estate. So it wasn't that, kind of Putin wasn't going to get that anywhere. It's not like, but Trump's basically saying, we don't want Ukraine, here, have it, kind of problem. And the thing is that this isn't for America to resolve all on its own. It's very important for us to have leadership, and it's very important for us to continue to support Ukraine in finding a solution to this. But this is really about the future of European security, and it is much more importantly, from the United States perspective, a question of the global security and the international security order. Because I've already mentioned the cast of countries that are supporting Russia in this war in Ukraine. And I would actually say, and I've said this publicly several times now, Ukraine has become a proxy war against the United States. Putin says Ukraine is a proxy war of the West against Russia. That's not the case. I mean, what we're trying to do in Ukraine is get Russia out of Ukraine. Nobody wants Russian territory. Ukraine's not taking the Kursk or bits of the Kursk region to keep this. It's trying to basically use this as kind of, leverage. We don't want Russia. We don't want to see Russia defeated. I mean, in fact, that's kind of part of the problem. We do not want to see the collapse of Russia. We don't want Russia just to stop what it's doing here, cease and desist, and, basically have done with this and leave Ukraine alone. But Putin has been basically saying, come on, one and all, this is a war against the United States and NATO and the West. And anybody who's got a beef with the United States, not with Ukraine, can join me in pursuing this war. So North Korea and Iran are now all in with supporting Putin. It's gone from just sending some drones on the part of Iran to a broader alliance between Russia and Iran, to the point, in fact, we're worried now about the fact that Russia might be helping Iran with its own missile capacity and perhaps with its nuclear program. And 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, and certainly when I was in the administration, Russia was actually behind the scenes helping us with Iran. And remember that Russia was part of the Iran nuclear agreement, the so-called JCPOA, which Trump basically blew up. Not actually completely out of just a desire to rip up treaties. I mean, he was right that there was a problem there with the fact that Iran could still over time get a nuclear weapon, and we were really worried about what Iran was doing with ballistic missiles and support for all of these Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, et cetera, et cetera. But Russia was behind the scenes actually working with us actively to try to constrain Iran. They didn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Now they're kind of all in with Iran, in ways that they weren't before. Similarly with North Korea. In fact, Putin's gone kind of Kim Jong-un rogue in terms of his threatening with, rogue use of tactical nuclear weapons. And he's now aiding and abetting Kim Jong-un and North Korea in, their more aggressive stance in the Asia-Pacific region, worrying the heck out of South Korea and out of Japan, who are also now trying to help Ukraine because of all of this, and also because of China. And again, Russia was behind the scenes helping us with North Korea. So we've had a complete flip because of what's happened in Putin's mind about Ukraine in terms of now Putin's willingness to enter this kind of rogues gallery of alliances with Iran and North Korea. Now, I don't think China wants to be part of a weird pact with Russia, North Korea, and Iran, but for China, any opportunity to basically confound the United States at this particular point will be taken, because China is also of the view that if Ukraine, doesn't win the war and ends up, having to give up territory, or however this ends up, but, as long as Russia wins, this is actually better for China in the long run with its aspirations to regain sovereignty over Taiwan, and also with all the other territorial disputes it has with a hell of a lot of other states, Japan, South Korea, India, Vietnam, the Philippines, et cetera, that this might strengthen China's hand because everyone will be like, "Whoa, we don't want this to happen to us." So it's actually very important for the United States, for all of these reasons, to make sure that Russia does not win in Ukraine and that Russia cease and desists and that Ukraine prevails. I mean, we haven't defined how that will be, but it's very important to be sending a signal that, no, you don't get away with this. War does not work. Aggression does not work. And, basically that this is, a battle and a series of battles that cannot be run because so much is riding on it. And also on the nuclear front, I do want to mention this because it is very important. And, I mean, all of you are well aware, Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons because we pushed it to, that it inherited from the collapse of the Soviet Union, along with Belarus. Where's Belarus now? Absorbed by Russia. And Kazakhstan. I mean, for good reasons, we wanted them to give up those nuclear weapons. We were worried, and you were in the State Department then, you were in the military then, about command and control over nuclear weapons. We were worried about rogue, loose nukes, suitcase bombs, all kinds of things. We should be very worried about those things now. Because we undertook, the United States, along with the United Kingdom, this is why the UK is all in on supporting Ukraine in part, and also because Ukraine, for United Kingdom, is where UK was in World War II as well, beleaguered and, not getting support in the way that it hoped in the early stages of the war. But we basically said to Ukraine, don't worry, get rid of the nuclear weapons and you'll be fine. We didn't, say we'd kind of come in and fight for them, but we said, we'll make sure that nothing happens to your sovereignty and territorial integrity. And Russia agreed to this as well, and Russia reneged on that. And Russia assumes that nobody's going to do anything against Russia, and we've been deterring ourselves all the time because Russia is a nuclear power. And Putin keeps saying, I'm going to use a nuclear weapon. Well, that's a message to the rest of the world that you either need a nuclear weapon to make sure that your neighbor doesn't predate on your territory, or, if you've got a nuclear weapon, you can do whatever the heck you want. And there are a lot more nuclear powers in the world now than there used to be. We've got India and Pakistan, we've got China that's trying to get parity with us right now on the strategic nuclear front. Well, now we've got an awful lot of other countries that, we know but we're not supposed to talk about who also have nuclear weapons. And we've got other countries who would now like them. And I was in Germany last year, and I was really shocked to find that Germans were seriously starting to think about, well, maybe Germany ought to have nuclear weapons along with other European powers. I mean, France and the UK have nuclear weapons. And maybe it wasn't just sufficient to have France and the UK as nuclear powers in NATO, but if the United States wasn't going to be around to help, maybe they should be nuclear weapons. Japan and South Korea are wondering, will the United States support them? And if they don't support Ukraine, why would they support Japan and South Korea? And maybe Japan and South Korea also have to have nuclear weapons. And China previously was very worried that the way that North Korea was marauding around with nuclear weapons and Kim Jong-un was shooting missiles off all over the place, so that might encourage Japan and South Korea. But we kept saying to them, no, don't worry, our nuclear umbrella is over you. Everything's going to be fine. Well, this war in Ukraine has persuaded an awful lot of people that things are not fine, including on the nuclear front. And if Vladimir Putin decides to cross the threshold of using a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, what's to stop others from deciding to do the same in other places in the Middle East? Or, Putin has already created a dirty bomb. Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned, this is pretty gruesome, with polonium and walked all the way around London shedding polonium. He was a human dirty bomb. And Putin has already poisoned people with Novichok, basically a chemical weapon that was so secret that only a handful of countries knew about it. Now we all know about it. And they've done all kinds of gruesome and diabolical things. And so we should be now extraordinarily worried that this war in Ukraine has basically been a pivotal point that has really kind of transformed the war of conflict. And again, as I said before, it's World War I meets the 21st century. And this is a global conflict, whether we like it or not. And resolving it is incumbent on us as well to be part of in a way that does not lead to more negative outcomes, including on the nuclear front.
Well, you've certainly succeeded in scaring the children and the old people here. So what I would like to do is give you an opportunity in the close, because I've read your book, and I felt that the most powerful chapter was the last chapter, the one where you offer some recommendations and some solutions. So what I'd like to do is give you the remaining time to talk a little bit about what's in that book that I thought was some very, very good guidance for everyone from students to teachers to just old retired guys like me. So the floor is yours, ma'am.
No, well, thanks. And look, even on that scary front, don't be scared, be prepared is basically the message. Because you referenced in the introduction this lecture I gave, the Wreath Lecture for the BBC. It was part of a series tied to Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. And I was given freedom from fear, which is kind of an interesting one. The other ones were all a bit more positive. But I used the war in Ukraine as a frame for this because, look, Ukrainians did not expect to be invaded. And they could have been absolutely terrified by what happened to them, but they all got up and acted. This was a whole of society effort to try to push, basically Russia back. And when I was a kid, the reason that, or a teenager, like I was in high school, like many of the students, kind of here and, just about to go to college. The reason that, as I said before, that I decided to study Russian was to try to kind of figure out why was everything happening. So instead of being afraid, I decided to try to study Russian. And I actually have a mug like this in my office that came from the Kennan Institute, which is one of the places that, basically is for scholarship for Russia. And it says, "Keep calm, study Russia," on the mug. And what I try to do at the end of this book is try to think about all the ways in which all of us can act. There's not just one guy anywhere that decides anything. Even though Vladimir Putin is the one guy who decided to invade Ukraine, it was Ukrainians as a whole population who got agency to decide to try to take some action to push him back. And although things look kind of dire, we've all got the opportunity to act. And I kind of really believe that action begins here in local communities. We're all acting now, right? We're all engaging in a dialogue to become better informed. I'm getting better informed by the questions because I'm thinking of things I hadn't necessarily thought about before. I'm not going to do that Kylie Jenner Robin Hood thing again. And when I said that, I was like, oh no, that did not work. I'll be getting lots of memes probably about that from that on the internet. You always kind of, as you're talking things through, you learn something. You learn something by, the opportunity to interact with people. And, you learn through learning. And I think, one of the most amazing opportunities we have is that, again, in America, everything we do have the opportunity for a fresh start. We always have the opportunity to learn something new. And we always have the opportunity to work together to make a difference. So some of the things that I mentioned in the book, again, is just the power of mentorship. I wouldn't have studied Russian if it hadn't been for, one of my relatives basically saying to me, hey, Fiona, you're good at languages. Why don't you study Russian and figure out why Russia's trying to blow us up? And then I would never have been able to learn Russian in the first instance if it hadn't been for the help of my local community. This is a bit, kind of strange and, again, twists of fate. But I got my first grant to study Russian from the Miners Association in County Durham, Durham Miners Association. And they had got money from the miners of Donbass. So the miners from the Donbass region, the Soviet Union, the very region that we've been looking at, as part of these miners' solidarity movements that kind of emerged out of the workers' unit. Now, of course, some of that money could have come from the KGB. There was always the manipulation of unions, across the Soviet Union, as you're very well aware, from the period in the State Department. Not everything was as it seemed. But the miners of County Durham and Donbass had been having exchanges going back to the 1920s. And in fact, Donbass, the city of Donetsk, used to be called Husivka because the coal mines were developed by Welsh coal miners and also by Scottish and miners brought from County Durham and elsewhere around Europe by a Welsh industrialist, Mr. Hughes, in the 1890s. So there was all these solidarities about these from these old industrial regions because they were all invested in by the same sets of industrialists, some from America. There was all these ties to the Pennsylvania coalfields and Wales and Northern England and Scotland. And that miners' solidarity, the miners had sent money as part of their dues, for the kids of coal miners during miners' strikes. And there was a miners' strike when in the UK at the time when I was there. And though my dad hadn't been a coal miner for decades by that point, I was also told by a relative that there were grants of money for the kids of coal miners for educational purposes. And so I went on the bus with my dad to the miners' hall, Red Hills, Pitman's Parliament, which is about to open up as a community hub, because there's no more miners really in County Durham anymore. And we went into a little office, and a man looked at my dad's work record and asked me how much I needed for this course. And he went away and came back with £100 in an envelope in £20 notes, and then told me I had to come back and just tell them what I'd done with it. So I was just like blown away by that. But the whole point is to kind of, think about, what you can do to, help kids from the community who, want to get some educational opportunity. All of us can be mentors, for someone younger. We can be peer mentors. As younger people, you can, kind of get together with older people and do, kind of upward mentoring and downward mentoring and work in groups like this. World Affairs Councils are amazing things. That's one of the reasons why I'm here, from meeting many of you at World Affairs Council events in Washington, D.C. I've been to World Affairs Councils across the entire country at this point, in community colleges and high schools. We can all do something to make a difference. Having just an open dialogue about this that's not politicized, that's, trying to just talk about the facts, educating ourselves on what's happening, registering to vote, going out there, getting people to vote, talking just in honest terms to your neighbour about the importance of volunteering at your local library instead of fighting about what books are on the shelves. Libraries are also services. I got ahead as a kid because I went to the library. Librarians would tell me about scholarships, opportunities. At that time there was no internet, so I would say I'm looking for a course. They'd look something up and tell me about something. We used to have our Citizens Advice Bureau to help people who couldn't pay their electrical bills about how they could get help with this, sitting there in the library. One of my friends is head of the development for the Denver Public Library, and they get people to help to get back to work by, getting them the resources they need, helping them with resumes, helping them get a suit. When I was getting my first real job, one of the faculty members at Harvard went out and bought me a suit because I didn't have the money for a suit, and told me a few tricks, kind of about how to make this suit, because I only had one suit, look like it was a different suit every single day by, kind of just having big earrings or, kind of put a scarf around it, And she said, men wear the same suit every day, you just don't realize it because, they've got a different tie on. You can do the same kind of thing. So, basically at the back of the book, I try to suggest to people that we all have agency, we all have action, and sometimes foreign affairs can just be seen out of our realm. But they're really not. You can start at your local community level by getting engaged. And there are so many networks of people helping Ukraine across the country, or helping people in all kinds of extreme circumstances. And if there's a natural disaster, any kind of disaster, the first people who are going to help you are your neighbours. So I would just also say, let's just look out for one another, because that's what's happening in Ukraine. And I just saw there's a most amazing story in the paper today about these terrible floods across Europe. And there are people in a Polish town who saved their town from flooding, with everything from, I think it's called Nice, the town, NYS or NYZ, and the entire town, including the men's volleyball team came out and filled sandbags and managed to prevent the river from flooding the banks and rescuing people. And they, they realized, the day after that they are themselves who saved the town because nobody else was going to come in and help them. And that's what we can all do. We can all kind of help each other and remember that we're Americans, not that we're this or that we're that or the other, but that we're neighbours and we're members of a community. And that's why this kind of place and Traverse City is so important in doing the things that you're doing. So thank you for having me.
I think, yeah, don't everybody leave at once. I think that's an excellent place to conclude, but I'd like to ask for another round of applause for Dr. Fiona Hill and Stan. This was just wonderful. Thank you. Well done. So, I feel a little bit like the minister trying to read the announcements after the sermon. But please bear with me for 1 minute more. We're going to talk about what's coming up next. On October 3rd, we are partnering with the Old Art Building in Leland, Michigan. We'll be hosting Chris Elstoff, Consul General of Australia. He'll address security, economic, and climate issues in the Indo-Pacific. There won't be an online option, so that is an in-person only event, and you need to go to the IAF website to purchase tickets. On 9 October, we return to global migration and the southern border. Our in-person speaker is Alan Burson, former Commissioner for Customs and Border Protection, and our remote speaker will be Andrew Seeley, President of the Migration Policy Institute. On 14 November, we will host John Pornor. John is the CEO and founder of Government Analytica, and he will address the global energy landscape amidst climate change. Now, don't forget, IAF is a member-driven organization. If you like what you heard, we need you to join. These programs are only possible through you. Have a safe journey home. As you talk to your friends and family about what you heard, resolve to make a difference. And in the words of Dr. Hill, you have the capacity to make a difference. So go forth and do great things. Thank you.